One of the things that happened between 2019 and today was COVID-19. Some of the political issues that were on the table came very much to the fore. One of the issues was the issue of freedom, and in particular the context was the freedom not to wear a mask, the freedom not to get vaccinated. That issue about whether government should mandate or not mandate really became at the center of the public discourse. That question may not sound like an economic question, but it really is. That is at the center of economics because it's about trade-offs.
Now it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, a professor at Columbia University. He is known for his pioneering work on asymmetric information, and his research focuses on income distribution, climate change, corporate governance, public policy, macroeconomics, and globalization. It's nice to know that you have a small niche. Professor Stiglitz was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Professor Bill Clinton and served as, pardon me?
I think you said professor.
Oh, under President Bill Clinton, and served as chief economist of the World Bank. His latest book, The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society, is a compelling new vision of an economic and political system that delivers well-being, opportunity, and meaningful freedom for all. Professor Stiglitz, welcome back to the Commonwealth Club. You've been with us before. Let me start off by asking what must be on the minds of some of your admirers who've come tonight. You have published a series of very well-received books. What new did you have to say in this book, which is your first major book since 2019?
Well, one of the things that happened between 2019 and today was COVID-19. And some of the political issues that were on the table came very much to the fore. And one of the issues was the issue of freedom. And in particular, the context was the freedom not to wear a mask, the freedom not to get vaccinated. In the midst of the pandemic, that issue about whether government should mandate or not mandate vaccines, social distancing, really became at the center of the public discourse. And that question may not sound like an economic question, but it really is. It's a question that is at the center of economics because it's about trade-offs. And this was an idea that I've thought about for a long time, and this was an occasion to write it down, which is, as I put it, one person's freedom is another person's unfreedom. Or as Isaiah Berlin, a great Oxford philosopher, put it, freedom for the wolves has often meant death for the sheep. So the point is that one person's freedom to carry an AK-47 is putting another person's life at risk. One person not getting vaccinated or maintaining social distancing or masking puts at risk other people's lives. And so if you start looking at a lot of the key issues, economic issues that we face, they fall within the same remit. The idea of the right to pollute, is that a freedom? Well, the freedom to pollute is taking away the rest of the world's freedom to live a life without climate change or some kinds of pollution will mean the ability of somebody with asthma to live. So that was the core of my motivation for writing the book. But of
So
course,
you're really
then I got.
redefining freedom, or at least presenting an alternate view of freedom.
That's right, and interestingly, when I first started, writing, a lot of people said, "Is this economics?" But actually, there's been a long tradition of economists writing precisely on this subject. One of the earliest was John Stuart Mill, one of the great economists of the 19th century, who wrote a famous book called On Liberty. And he was more focused at the time on notions of tolerance in a very broadly defined way. But in the middle of the last century, two famous right-wing economists wrote books that were very influential. Friedrich Hayek wrote, both of them got Nobel Prizes. Friedrich Hayek wrote a book called The Road to Freedom, The Road to Serfdom. And my book is obviously a riff off of that. He wrote the book in 1944 as England was debating the welfare state. Keynes, the world had just emerged from the Great Depression, and Keynes had explained how governments could prevent that kind of great deep downturn and could get you out of it. And he was worried that all this attention on the role of the government would lead to a large government, and he believed that that would lead to serfdom, to a subservient individual. I think he was 180 degrees wrong. That what we see around the world is that authoritarian populism arising not in places where there's a lot of government providing social protection like the Scandinavian countries, but in countries like the United States where we've not done enough to protect individuals.
You bring two bodies of thought into this book that I think have much more emphasis than in your past writing. One is the moral philosophers, and you use John Rawls considerably. My background is teaching ethics at Stanford and Santa Clara, so I was interested in your use of Rawls and Amartya Sen. And the other was you're bringing some of the new insights from behavioral economics into it. Can you tell us why those are important to this kind of analysis?
Before I do that, let me mention one thing, which is the other right-wing author who I think gave the wrong answer, modestly, in my view, was Milton Friedman, who taught with you at Stanford and at Hoover Institution.
In a diabolical sense, they put he and I against one another for the business school's 75th anniversary.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So he wrote a book called Capitalism and Freedom. And he argued that a free market economy was both important for itself, that is, for economic efficiency, and for democracy, for political freedom. And he was wrong on both accounts. Or, part of my own work was to show that free, unrestrained markets are not efficient. Unfettered markets are not efficient, and it's obvious from we see deep downturns with Great Recession, Great Depression. We see pollution. We see a host of problems. Purdue, the opioid episode, diabetes, childhood diabetes, financial exploitation, a whole set of problems of underregulated markets. But Friedman was not really concerned with political freedom. I mean, he was perfectly happy to go down to Chile and work with Pinochet to use an authoritarian government to impose his view of economics, which was this unrestrained ability to exploit, which resulted in, and one of the things he did is called free banking, and it resulted, as it did in the United States, in a major economic downturn. It took Chile 25 years to pay off the debt from that episode. So now to go back to your question, sorry about
So
that.
why philosophers and moralists and ethicists?
Well, there were two parts to your question. The first, Rawls, one has to have a framework for thinking about how you make trade-offs. And that's where John Rawls provided a framework. He applied it more narrowly to questions like inequality, taxation, what is a just tax system. And I wanted to apply it more broadly to think about social justice more broadly. And the simple idea that he put forward, as you know, is you have to remove yourself from the interest. So it's sort of behind a veil of ignorance. It's very similar to what Adam Smith had talked about, which is the impartial spectator. If you didn't know where you were going to be,
Didn't know whether you were going to be born rich or poor or American or...
And I sometimes say, you know, if you know that you're going to be born in the top 1/10 of 1%, America is a wonderful place to be born. But if you are just randomly dropped down anywhere in the income distribution, we're not so great. The median, the people in the middle, are not as do not do as well as about 15 other countries. So that was the idea that Rawls, and so he then asked the question, how do you make these trade-offs? In some cases, it's pretty easy. I mean, you know, the freedom, which is more important, the freedom to carry an AK-47 or the freedom to live? I think most of us would say
not to be subject to mass gun violence.
Exactly, mass gun violence. And it's more than being killed, it's the freedom of fear. You know, FDR talked about the freedom from fear, and, you know, every kid in kindergarten now, first grade, has to be trained what to do if somebody comes into your classroom, and how to get under the desk and so forth. Well, that's fear for the kids and fear for the parents about what will happen. Will their kids be attacked? And there's been a mass murder in the United States, you know, every week and almost every day. So Rawls gives a framework for thinking about how you make those decisions in the more difficult cases. In the easy cases, I think it's obvious. You don't need a complicated philosophy to figure out which is how you balance these. But in the harder cases, you do need to think hard about it.
How does the new advances in behavioral economics change the thinking of a Friedman or a Hayek or others?
Well, the standard view in economics for forever almost has been that people are born with a certain set of beliefs, preferences, what they wanted, behavioral patterns, and nothing changes over life. And any of us who are parents know that that's not true. I mean, obviously, we spend a lot of effort to try to make our children civilized and to change their behavior, to make them more generous, less selfish, more, what we say technically, other regarding, honest, you know, a whole set of virtues that we think are important. And I think we think that we have some influence. You know, they don't always turn out like we hope, but I think we have some influence. And part of the point that I emphasize in this book and in my more generally in work in modern behavioral economics is that the economic system shapes people. So if you work for a financial institution where you put money over everything else, so you don't care about, the story of Wells Fargo opening up accounts that people didn't have, or abusive credit card practices, or predatory lending, or fraudulent behavior. If money is the central thing, you wind up thinking more about money and being more materialistic. If you work in a cooperative, there is a likelihood, not necessary, but a likelihood that you wind up thinking more cooperatively in a more social context. And this is really important for our modern economy because a large fraction, a big part of our economy today is the care economy. And you want people who are caring for older people to care about them. And that's why, I always, when you have a hedge fund buying up homes that care for elderly people with Alzheimer's, you wonder, what is the comparative advantage of hedge funds in owning an old age home for people who can't really monitor what is going on? The reason is the hedge funds do a better job of exploitation. And so that should be a warning sign. And when hedge funds buy prisons, used to be a warning sign. Maybe they are doing it not because they're thinking about whether they could provide services to prisoners more efficiently. What is their comparative advantage in doing that? Their comparative advantage is squeezing.
Now, you are concerned with the impact of private decision-making. Friedman, of course, argued that was one of the virtues of the free market, was that the individual could be self-interested. Can you give us your basic critique of that position, that invisible hand will result in the best possible outcome?
Yeah. Well, I can put it a couple of ways. One of them, the idea of Adam Smith was that the pursuit of self-interest would lead, as if by an invisible hand, to the well-being of society. It was a great insight that what the outcomes at the macro level, at the society level, could be quite different from what the individual intended at the micro, at the individual level. So it was a wonderful idea. The only problem is it's not right. Or, as I wrote in one of my books, the reason the invisible hand often seems invisible is that it's not there. And one of my own, one way of understanding that is to realize that there are two ways of making profits. One is the one that Friedman and people on the conservatives often talk about. You make a better product more cheaply, and that's the good side. But the other side is you figure out how to exploit people. You figure out how to become a monopolist. And even Adam Smith recognized the incentive on that side. You figure out how to take advantage of somebody, like the examples I gave before of predatory lending. You figure out, a central thrust of a lot of research in our tech giants. I know this is a sensitive topic here, and so
I got a couple questions for you on that.
But a key object of their research is figuring out how to target advertising, that's one thing, but even pricing. So the airlines, for instance, can figure out who to charge more and who to charge less. So you can be sitting on two different seats, two seats next to each other, and one pay 50% more than the other. That undermines, those of you who took economic courses, the basis of the efficiency of the market economy was that everybody pays the same price. And that kind of optimal price discrimination actually undermines the efficiency of the economy. What they're trying to do is take out as much we call the consumer surplus from each individual. So that's sort of trying to design a system that can optimize rent extraction from society. And that's not welfare maximizing.
So your critique is that the typical corporation or the typical business actor is going to engage in what you have quite a bit on, price gouging, exploitation, and so on, and therefore the Friedman theory or the Hayek theory is simply invalid.
That's right.
That's unavoidable.
That's right.
Private business will engage in that behavior.
In the absence of very good information and in the absence of very strong competition, and you look around our economy and there's a lot of imperfections of information, we all know that, and very limited competition. And you have 2, 3 telephone companies, 2, 3 internet providers. In every niche of the market, there's some competition, but very, very limited, and that's what leads to this exploitation. Friedman, with his wife, wrote a book called Free to Choose, and I relabeled it Free to Exploit.
You had a surprise comment deep in the book about the information economy and what I interpreted as a comment about Silicon Valley, which was that there are great advantages in terms of innovation and maybe a lighter hand in terms of regulation or control might be justified maybe for a time. Can you help us understand your view about the modern information economy? Do all of your ideas apply equally in that arena?
Well, one of the central ideas that I try to push is that actually you want to direct innovation in a way that is promoting the well-being of society. And if you were asked, if you look at where we are devoting a lot of our research, scarce research resources, what is the object that they're trying to do? They're trying to build a better advertising engine, a better way of extracting consumer surplus out of individuals. If I were listing the real needs of society, at the top of my list would be things like addressing the problem of climate change. So you can see there clearly Adam Smith's invisible hand isn't working. It's not directing resources to clearly our most important societal problem, but rather, will building a better advertising engine really enhance the well-being of our society?
Your definition of progressive capitalism relies on some steps now to get to that better state. And the first is regulation. And you have a very thorough treatment of market failures and how unrestrained corporate activity could lead to very bad effects. And decent regulation would result in much better. One of the critics I read said, Joe's solution is always more regulation. How do you respond to that criticism?
Well, it isn't always, it's the right regulation. And in many cases, it's actually reducing, you have to design the regulation correctly. But one of the ideas I try to get across in the book is that regulations, contrary to what is often said, can often be freeing. And let me give you an example that illustrates that. And it relates to the notion of freedom I have, which is freedom to do, expanding what you can do in a meaningful way. So the idea here is that exemplified by a stoplight. A stoplight is a restriction, it's a regulation. Yes. You can't go until it's your turn, red. But in a place like New York City, if you didn't have stoplights, you'd have gridlock. Mm-hmm. So nobody could move. So stoplights, by giving people one turn after another, you actually get traffic to flow. So everybody's freedom is increased by a regulation. Now, that's actually a metaphor for lots of other things. Let me give you an example. We wouldn't be here in this way if we hadn't had the COVID-19 vaccine. That was a great achievement, done very quickly, because we already had the mRNA platform for vaccines, and then we very quickly developed from that platform to the COVID-19 mRNA vaccine. Now, you wouldn't have had that without government-supported research. But that requires resources. That requires taxes. Taxes are a form of regulation, a compulsion. You have to do something. You lost your freedom. But losing that little freedom that you have to pay taxes has expanded the freedom of our whole society in our ability to live. So there are so many other examples. Right now we are reminded, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that there are authoritarian countries that represent a challenge to our broader sense of political freedom. But to fight that, we need taxes, and that's a form of compulsion.
Again, your critics are concerned. You make the argument these regulations do have to be very well structured and very well designed. And the critics say that our government is very poor at that process of writing regulations, and that in some ways leads to Friedman's observation or other conservatives that we're better to rely on an invisible hand. Why do you have so much confidence in our governmental process to write good regulation?
Well, first, I don't have perfect confidence. Let me make it clear. I think anybody who's lived through a Bush administration, let alone a Trump administration, knows that government often doesn't work well. But anybody who's also lived through the 2008 financial crisis knows that markets don't work well on their own. And if it hadn't been for government, we would have been in another deep depression after the financial crisis that was caused by the market. The government failed. There was a government failure, but it was failure to restrain the market from excessive risk-taking and predatory lending. But it was a failure of government to do its part of the job. So the view that I have is that all human institutions are frail and have limitations. And so an essential part of the idea of progressive capitalism is that you have a rich ecology of institutions. You need collective action. You need private enterprise. You need regulations. You need public investment. You need systems of checks and balances. And you need to think about what is needed for a system of checks and balances to work. And one of the things I argue that you need for a system of checks and balances to work is not to have an excess of inequality. Because if you have an excess of inequality, then it will almost inevitably be the case that those with all the money will also have disproportionate power.
If your definition of freedom involves somehow leveling the playing field for the poor and others with opportunities, how do you get the rich, how do you get those with the power today to somehow cooperate in the kind of progressive capitalist movement or restructuring of government process that you foresee?
Well, first of all, I think it's a better society in which, I think even those at the top, an enlightened capitalism, you might say, an enlightened self-interest would realize that where we're going is not sustainable. That the kind of capitalism we have is not, I think, in the long run, going to be sustainable. The lack of trust, and that's just from the narrow economic point of view. But then, what we mentioned earlier, that the extremes of inequality, the despair that that is generated by the lack of opportunity leads to a politics of authoritarian populism. So it's neither economically sustainable on its own because of the lack of trust that you really need for markets to function, but it's not politically sustainable. So anybody looking at it from the level of what kind of society do I want, would say, I think, some variant of what I've been putting forward here in progressive capitalism is really the only system that's going to be sustainable.
And that doesn't rely on virtuous behavior by individuals, or does it? Does it?
It relies on certain enlightened, self-interested, but not everybody is enlightened. So the hope is that we're still a democracy, enough of a democracy, that enough people understand these ideas. That's why I wrote the book, that there will be a broad progressive democratic movement that will make this part of the law of the land.
Let's talk about the international impacts of all this. You have contributed so much international economics. So does this set of principles that you've applied to the United States, does it have impact similarly around the world? What is this unfettered, if you like, free market approach do globally in economics?
Well, there are two aspects of your question. One of them is looking, we've been a role model for the world, and people look at us as for the virtues of a capitalist system. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, people looking at the United States the way it is right now don't see a society that they want to emulate. They see some aspects they want to emulate, obviously, some of the successes. But when they see the levels of inequality, they see the support for authoritarian populism, they see the fact that our life expectancy is lower than in any of the other advanced countries and is in decline. Studies on well-being, for the average level of well-being, education for the United States is not that good. It's way down in the list. They say, well, something's wrong here. So we've not been selling our, you might say, economic political model very well. A real breaking point was the financial crisis of 2008. And what's happened after that has really changed people's view of our political and economic system. So that's one aspect that I think the kinds of reforms that, if we could do it, it would have a big influence over the model for the rest of the world. But then I do have one chapter in the book, where I talk about the analogous issues of freedom across countries, and I talk about, when you sign international agreement, you're imposing a restraint on yourself. It's taking away your freedom. But the hope is, if you design agreements correctly, it's expanding freedom for everybody in a more meaningful way. The problem is, at the international level, too often it's power that dominates over really a Rawlsian conception of what would expand the well-being of the global society.
And again, I keep coming back to this mechanism by which we come to a consensus around what level of taxation, what level of increased opportunity for the poor, so that that liberty or that freedom is enhanced for everyone. And I'm wondering how what kind of dialogue might lead us as a country to that kind of consensus.
Well, I think the word that you used is the right word, dialogue. I think we have to, I think of the key approach here is, I think, is the idea of the Enlightenment, that you have to reason. It's all about reasoning. And, to me, as an economist, the big breaking point in the history, economic history, was the Enlightenment. Before that, standards of living have been roughly constant for hundreds and for thousands of years. And suddenly, beginning with the Enlightenment, standards of living started to increase very rapidly. And what was the reason for that? Well, there are two things. We started reasoning about the world, science, to try to understand the nature of the world. We thought we could reason, we could approach it in a rational way and understand things, but also about social organization, rule of law, how do we coordinate large societies to work together to produce outcomes that are better for all of us. And so to answer your question, it's a kind of reasoning, identifying the trade-offs that we were talking about, and then trying to have a discussion about how we reason about how we make those trade-offs.
Can we get, I was going to say, to first base here with your definition of freedom. Can the right, you take a number of pot shots at the right in your book, and one of the most difficult ones is that the right does not necessarily see that freedom means that every individual has freedoms, and that by restraining through taxation and so on, we increase the freedom of the poor. What I have tended to think about we level the playing field or equality of opportunity, not necessarily result. Can that concept be sold, that we've got to have income transfers and educational opportunity and,
It's more than, let me say, it's more than that. It's the rules of the game. It's the basic rules of the game of our society. We need competition laws to make sure that people don't get abusive market power. We need consumer protection to protect people from exploitation, particularly in the presence of imperfect information, asymmetries of information. We need laws that govern the imbalance of labor-employer relations, labor relations laws, corporate governance laws. So, and all those affect the market distribution of income. So you need a more just market distribution of income, but then you also need to redistribute. We're never going to get unanimity about this, but I think that if you understand the nature of trade-offs, on a lot of these issues, I think we can get a much broader consensus that people really can come to understand that the right to live is more important than the right to carry an AK-47. I mean, just as one example. There are going to be some people who are going to say, I have the right to carry a gun and kill people, but that's going to be a minority view.
The process of putting all of this together politically is a difficult one. And one of your arguments is that the free market approach that we have taken has skewed our political process and power. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, that's fairly obvious that the way, there's so many aspects of this that the role of money in politics in America is greater than in other countries. The gerrymandering gives disproportionate votes to some political power to some. We had a Supreme Court that ruled that you can have unlimited spending to distort the political system.
Are those effects from a free market and the accumulation of power that results from the free market? Is that your argument?
Most political systems recognize that money corrupts the political system and therefore restrain the role of money. We said we're not going to have, our Supreme Court said we're not going to have any restraint. Now, that was a 5-4 decision. And I agreed with the 4, that was a misinterpretation of what free speech means. Free speech and democracy doesn't mean that you have unbridled sway of money. And the Supreme Court has made a number of other flawed decisions influenced, as I say, disproportionately by money in politics. The gerrymandering decision was one that made absolutely no sense. It said, we're going to leave that to the states, but the states are gerrymandered. So how can a gerrymandered state regulate gerrymandering? I mean, if you think about just the logic of it, you wonder how could they come to a decision like that? Other countries have thought, I think, more deeply about how you can get a better democratic outcome. I mean, for instance, in Australia, they have compulsory voting. Almost every other country has the view that voting should occur on a Sunday when people are not at work, rather than a work day, with some of our states trying to make very difficult for working people to vote. So you can see how we've systematically reduced the franchise, and that has affected the underlying democratic values.
So before we go to questions, and I've got the start, and I hope there are more coming in, let's get to the information and media landscape that you spend quite a bit of time on in the book. How do your ideas work out in the media landscape of today? Is that an expression of control by the powerful and a runaway free market?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the question is what we believe is obviously affected by what information we have and how that information is presented. But who gets to decide what information gets disseminated? Well, right now, it's the people who control the media, including the social media.
Right.
And that's when it's left up to the market, means those with the money to buy these critical facilities that many other countries have created independent, credible public institutions. It doesn't shut down the private one, but at least it creates an alternative source of information. Some of the Scandinavian countries have also gone even further, and they say it's important to have diversity of information. So they've supported a second newspaper in various towns and various places. One of the really disturbing things that's happened in the last 15 years without people really realizing it is how the social media have taken away the major revenue source of advertising from the legacy media. And so the information ecosystem, the economic basis of that has really been undermined. And Google claims it has the right to steal knowledge that's been produced by other people without compensating them. The state of California has now been debating it, and the governor has weighed in on the wrong side on that issue.
Has he decided whether to sign?
No, he hasn't, but everybody believes he's weighed in on the wrong side, and the general sense is that and because he's weighed in, the bill that is likely to go through is not going to make Google pay for the news that they've taken from others.
And then there's a AI a bill also in front of him. He's deciding now which to veto and which to.
And the interesting thing on all this is that, of course, that Google doesn't want AI to take information from them, but Google wants to take information from everybody else. And so the basic principle of Google is protect their own property.
Yes.
And steal from others.
All right. Let me start with some questions from the audience. You're invited to give some more examples of what you think are particularly well-crafted regulations beyond the stoplight and the perhaps all of us driving on the right.
Well, that's a very simple regulation that works actually well. But actually, there are a lot of very simple regulations. I mean, I'm obviously very concerned about climate change. A regulation that says no coal burning electric generating plants is a very simple regulation, very easy to enforce. You can see whether it's using coal or not, which would be good for our society. The regulations about predatory lending. A lot of the financial regulations are not that complicated and are not that hard to enforce. So, other examples. It's very important if you're going to have investment to have disclosure of what the firm is doing. But you want that disclosure to be honest. So a regulation that says if you say something, it has to be true is not a very complicated. I mean, it is, because in some cases there are ambiguities, but in some cases, it's very clear what it means to lie.
So by each of those, you restrict the freedom, perhaps of an individual actor, the seller of the securities, but you improve the freedom of everybody else that they can trade in the market without concern for lack of information.
Exactly, for a lie. The whole market couldn't function if everybody was lying. We don't realize how important fraud laws are. One of the things about a good legal system is you don't actually have to enforce it very much because people obey it. And so if we didn't have fraud laws, I can tell you there'd be a lot more fraud. And then we would really be worrying every time you go to a store and it says X, it may not be true. So every time you buy a stock, it could, the company may be just based on fraud. We know a lot. The example of the Friedman. So there are lots of these regulations that are so essential to the functioning of every one of our markets.
So there's concern about climate change in a couple of the questions. And my sense is that that's become more important in your thinking as an example of market failure and an example of we're all toast, we don't have much freedom if climate change is not addressed. How do we make progress on that in this political environment?
Well, part of the answer is to change the political environment. The fact of the matter is, the reality of climate change is forcing its way on our we can't ignore it. It's 20 years ago we could pretend to ignore it. We can't today. And let me try to give you a part of the reason for that is, just 70 years ago, when I was young, you and I were young, the GDP was 1/15 of what it is today in the world. In other words, over the last 70 years, GDP has increased 15-fold, and population has increased 3-fold. So we were inside our planetary boundaries when we were born. We aren't anymore. So we could ignore those issues in a sense when 50 years ago. We can't anymore. And so that's why I think we will be taking action. The rest of Europe is much more conscious, let me say, of climate change. And I think they will start imposing cross-border taxes on American goods if we continue to pollute in the way we are.
There's a question that's related to this in the sense of, are we moving towards much more industrial policy and massive regulation in the United States in order to deal with crises like climate change? Are we looking at an era coming with a much more active government than we've had in the past?
I think we are, and it's for two reasons. You hinted at one, which is that the externalities, the effects that we do on others, have become so much more important as we become a more urbanized economy, a society. We are much more urbanized. When you live together, you have effects on each other. Noise, noise pollution, air pollution, all kinds of pollution. So that's really an aspect of modern society that's very different from where you were when you lived in separate farms, separated from each other. So a modern integrating society has more externalities, and climate change being the strongest one, that we have to have regulations. And the second one is we live in an innovative economy. Innovation is just much more important. It's all about research. And basic research is a public good.
The internet.
The internet.
mRNA.
Those are things that the private sector won't typically do enough investment in. And so you need government to do that basic research, and then the private sector can do the last mile, converting it into useful products.
But during the Biden administration, the last 3.5 years, we've had massive investments in chip technologies and in some other areas. Is that part of the future for U.S. policy?
I think so. That's part of the future, that these industrial policies, public investments, and that illustrates another aspect of market failures we haven't talked about. Markets tend to be short-term and don't evaluate risks from a societal point of view. We saw that very clearly during the COVID-19, where we saw that the markets were not resilient. We couldn't even produce face masks, protective gear, let alone complicated products like ventilators or tests. We had given up our productive capacities, which in normal times we might not need, but the market didn't recognize that there might be times when we would want those. And an example of the kinds of choices that increased the frailty of the market was just-in-time inventories. So just-in-time worked well when everything was working well. But the moment things aren't working well, the whole system collapsed. And we saw it, an even more dramatic example, I think, was how Germany, in its private markets, got so dependent on Russian gas. And so when Russia invaded Ukraine, they had an energy crisis. I had written about how foolish that was back in one of my earlier books called Making Globalization Work in 2006. I wrote that Germany, it was just so foolish of the private market. They didn't recognize the price of carbon. They also didn't recognize the value of risk.
A question which asks you to come back to this idea that the workings of the free market, if in a Friedman-esque sense, will lead to major destruction. And so beyond climate change, which is the example right in front of us, what other expressions are there of that? How else will the workings of the free market necessarily end up in damage to the society?
Well, the lack of resilience that I just gave in the case of Germany and Europe, and the lack of resilience that we saw in the United States. Right now, we've wound our up in a situation where here we are, a high-tech country, dependent totally dependent on Taiwan for our chips.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine what happens if China invades Taiwan?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we are totally dependent on China for most of the key natural resources, minerals, for a renewal for our electric vehicles. And the example, we owned many of those resources in Africa 10 years ago, but then we sold them to China. So that's an example where we've lost our national sovereignty, our national economic sovereignty, and that puts us in a frail position. Now, hopefully, those dire situations don't occur, but anybody rational looking at is there a risk that you ought to worry about? The answer is yes, and the free market just hasn't priced those risks into its decisions.
Question here about political reality and gridlock. There's so much work to be done to enact your vision of good regulation and balancing of interests and building a consensus. Do you have hope that it can be done in an era of political gridlock like we have today?
Well, I'm always hoping that we'll break that critical gridlock and that we'll get, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where the outcome of the election would be a victory for Harris and a Democrat. Right now it's 50-50 in the two houses, in the Senate and the House. Enough Democratic control in the House and Senate that we could pass. We could use the provision of the Constitution that says you can appoint more people to the Supreme Court to restore balance in the Supreme Court. I understand the reluctance after what happened with FDR to do that, but we're in an emergency now where so many rights have been abrogated by the Supreme Court that I don't think we have any choice.
As a final question, it's about progressive capitalism and what it takes to make progressive capitalism work. To what extent can we achieve progressive capitalism that relies on, if you like, the enlightened self-interest and the virtue of individuals and maybe even corporations, although you're skeptical of that? How can we bring that into existence? You talk about it very vividly, and we want it.
Yeah.
So how do we bring it?
Well, I said before that all human institutions are going to be frail, imperfect. What I'm arguing for is that we ought to be moving in that direction. I think we can move in that direction. We can create a better society. I talk about a good society. At least really my aspiration here is a better society, one where we do give more meaningful freedom to more people than we do today, and that we have a more enlightened discourse about what it means to be a good society and how we can achieve it.
A wonderful outcome if we can bring that about. Thank you. I want to thank Professor Joseph Stiglitz, author of The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society. His new book provides a wonderful vision of a progressive capitalism and of a society that has real freedom, a better understanding of freedom for all of its citizens. We encourage you to pick up a copy of the book, of Professor Stiglitz's book, here or at your local bookstore. And if you would like to support the club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Kirk Hansen. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.